You get your paycheck. Maybe it's a good one, maybe it's decent, whatever. And for like a day, maybe two if you're disciplined, you feel this little spark of possibility. Like this month is going to be different. This month you're going to save more, spend smarter, actually do the thing you keep telling yourself you'll do. And then life happens. The bill you forgot about, the dinner you really needed because it was a rough week, the thing on your phone that was on sale, and before you've even really processed it, most of that paycheck is just gone. And you're not broke exactly, but you're also not building anything. You're just kind of running on a treadmill that looks like progress but isn't really moving. I've had that feeling more times than I care to admit. My name is Sam, and honestly, I've spent an embarrassing number of hours, late nights, too much coffee, notebooks filled with half-finished budget charts, trying to understand why money works the way it does. Not just the math of it, because the math is actually pretty simple, but the psychology of it, the habits, the cultural patterns, the invisible rules that some people seem to follow almost effortlessly while the rest of us are out here Googling, why can't I save money at midnight? And what I kept coming back to over and over again was this fascinating set of principles that are deeply embedded in Chinese financial culture. Principles that don't really show up in Western personal finance books, but that quietly explain why, statistically, culturally, historically, Chinese households tend to accumulate wealth at rates that genuinely baffle economists. And I'm not talking about some ancient secret or mystical philosophy here. I'm talking about something so practical, so grounded, that once you hear it, you're going to wonder why nobody ever framed it this way before. It's almost annoyingly simple when you see it clearly. But like most things that are simple, it's also kind of hard. And the gap between knowing it and actually doing it, that's where everything gets interesting. So stick with me, because by the end of this, I genuinely think you're going to look at your own financial behavior differently. Not in a guilty way, in a useful way. The concept of jiejian, frugality as identity, not sacrifice. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning for understanding Chinese wealth-building culture is a word, jiejian. It roughly translates to frugality, but that translation doesn't really capture it. Because in English, frugality sounds kind of sad, right? It sounds like deprivation. It sounds like eating plain rice because you have to. But in Chinese cultural tradition, jiejian isn't about what you can't have. It's about what you choose to prioritize. There's a Confucian proverb, and I'm paraphrasing here, that essentially says a person who is frugal is not poor. They are simply preparing for the future. And this distinction is everything, because the way you frame a behavior determines whether you can sustain it. Think about it this way. If I tell you to go on a diet, your brain immediately hears deprivation. You're going to fight that. You're going to cheat on it. You're going to resent it. But if I reframe it as you're choosing to fuel your body differently because you care about how you feel 10 years from now, suddenly it's a value statement, not a punishment. Frugality works exactly the same way. In households that practice jejin, spending less isn't seen as failing to enjoy life. It's seen as evidence that you're thinking generationally, that you're someone with foresight. And here's the wild thing, that framing actually makes it feel good to save. There's pride attached to it. There's identity attached to it. And identity-based habits are the ones that actually stick. So the first question worth sitting with is this. What story are you telling yourself about saving money? Is it, I have to sacrifice? Or is it, I'm choosing to build? Because those two sentences will lead you to completely different places over a decade. The rule of paying yourself first. But the Chinese version goes further. Now, pay yourself first is not a new concept. You've probably heard it. Put money into savings before you spend. Automate it. Treat your savings like a bill. It's solid advice. But the Chinese approach to this goes a layer deeper, and that layer is what most people miss. The concept is sometimes called Zian Kun Hu Huai. Save first, spend what remains. And on the surface, yeah, that sounds like pay yourself first. But the cultural weight behind it is different. In Western personal finance, saving is often framed as a means to a goal. You save for a vacation, you save for a car, you save for retirement. The saving serves the spending eventually. In the Xian Kun Hu Hua framework, saving is not a means to an end. Saving is the end. Accumulating capital, growing your reserves, having more than you need, that is itself the goal. The spending that comes later isn't the reward for saving. The security and optionality that savings gives you, that is the reward. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds kind of joyless. Where's the fun in saving for saving's sake? And I get that. I really do. But here's the shift in perspective. When you accumulate capital without a specific spending target attached to it, you start seeing opportunities everywhere. You can invest in something unexpected. You can help a family member. You can start a business. You can take a calculated risk because you have a cushion. Money without a predetermined destination is actually the most flexible kind of money. This is why so many successful Chinese entrepreneurs, and this is well documented in economic research, seem to start businesses with relatively modest external funding because they've been quietly building capital for years with no specific plan for it. When the opportunity showed up, the money was just there. That's not luck. That's Xian Kun Hu Hua in action. The practical takeaway? Stop saving for things. Start saving for capacity. There's a difference, and it changes everything. The concept of face and how it keeps people broke. In China and everywhere else. Okay, here's where I have to get a little honest about the complexity of this, because I'd be doing you a disservice if I just painted Chinese financial culture as perfectly disciplined and wise. Because there's also this other thing, a mayansi or face. Social status, appearance. And it creates a tension that's genuinely fascinating. Mayansi is the reason why a family might save aggressively for 20 years and then spend an enormous amount on a wedding or a celebration. It's the reason why gifts in Chinese culture are often extravagant and why business banquets can cost more than a month's rent. Social reputation carries enormous weight, and money is one of the ways that reputation is expressed and maintained. And here's the thing. This isn't actually unique to Chinese culture. In America, it's the guy who can barely afford rent but drives a leased BMW. In Indonesia, it's the family that throws an extravagant party they'll be paying off for 3 years. In Nigeria, it's the wedding that costs more than the couple's combined annual income. Every culture has its version of Mianzi. Every culture has spending that's driven not by desire but by fear. Fear of being judged, fear of appearing less than. The wealthy families who successfully navigate Chinese financial principles don't eliminate the concept of face. They redirect it. Instead of status signaling through visible consumption, clothes, cars, parties, the status signal becomes something quieter. It becomes the ability to invest in your child's education. It becomes owning property. It becomes being the person in your family network who can provide when others can't. The reputation shifts from look how much I can spend to look how much I can provide. And that shift is subtle but monumental because providing requires accumulation, while displaying requires spending. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your spending is actually about what you want versus what you want other people to think about you. I'm not judging. I bought things purely for that reason. But awareness is the first step to changing it. The merchant mindset. Everyone is running a small business. One of the most interesting cultural tendencies in Chinese financial thinking is the almost universal application of what I'd call the merchant mindset. And this goes back centuries to the Shanghainese traders, the Cantonese merchants, the Hokkien business networks that spread across Southeast Asia. There's a deeply embedded cultural instinct to think of your household as a small business. What does that actually mean in practice? It means tracking money, not just roughly knowing where it went, but actually tracking it. It means thinking about return on investment for every significant expenditure. It means always asking, is this money going to work for me, or is it just leaving? There's a famous story, and I've heard variations of this from multiple sources, so it's more of a cultural archetype than a specific biography, about a first-generation Chinese immigrant who arrives in a new country with almost nothing. Within a generation, the family owns property, runs a business, and has sent children to top universities. And when people ask how, the answer is almost never, "we got lucky." It's almost always, "we spent less than we earned, we reinvested constantly, and we never stopped learning." That's a business. That is literally the operating model of a successful business, applied to a family's finances. Most of us don't think about our household finances this way. We think about them as a flow. Money comes in, money goes out. But the merchant mindset reframes it. Money comes in, some of it goes out strategically, and the rest gets deployed into something that generates more. Your household has a balance sheet. It has assets and liabilities. It has operating costs and investments. Once you start seeing it that way, the decisions you make with money become completely different. The practical application here is simple but not easy. Start tracking everything. Not to punish yourself, but to treat your household like a business owner treats their books. Because you are the CFO of your own financial life, whether you act like it or not. The Bamboo Network and the power of community capital. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in Western personal finance circles, and I think it's genuinely one of the most powerful concepts in this whole conversation. It's the idea of community capital, and in Chinese business culture, it often manifests through what scholars have called the Bamboo Network. Bamboo networks are informal systems of trust and mutual economic support that exist primarily within Chinese business communities, particularly across Southeast Asia. They're not banks. They're not formal investment funds. They're webs of relationship-based lending, investment, and opportunity sharing that operate on trust, reciprocity, and long-term thinking. There's a traditional practice called huiai, sometimes called a rotating credit association, that captures part of this spirit. A group of people, friends, family members, community members, each contribute a fixed amount of money every month into a shared pool. Each month, one person in the group receives the entire pool. It rotates until everyone has received their lump sum once. No interest, no bank, no bureaucracy. On the surface, it might seem like you're just getting your own money back eventually. But here's what Hui actually does psychologically. It creates commitment. It creates social accountability. And it delivers a lump sum that is much harder to accumulate when you're saving by yourself. Because saving by yourself has no external accountability. With Huai, if you don't contribute, you're letting down people you have real relationships with. That social pressure is a feature, not a bug. And the broader principle here, kita beyond Huai specifically, is that building wealth in isolation is genuinely harder than building it in community. the people you surround yourself with, the financial norms in your social circle, the conversations you're allowed to have about money, all of this shapes your trajectory more than most people are comfortable admitting. If everyone around you treats debt as normal, overspending as expected, and saving as boring, you will unconsciously drift toward those norms. If you can find or build a community where financial responsibility is respected and encouraged, the compound effect on your habits over 5 or 10 years is remarkable. This doesn't mean you need to find a Huey specifically, although honestly, that's not a bad idea. It means being intentional about your financial community. Who do you talk to about money? Who holds you accountable? Who celebrates your savings milestone with you? If the answer is nobody, that's something worth changing. Long-term thinking. The concept of chiku and enduring difficulty. There's another phrase that comes up constantly in Chinese financial philosophy, and it's chiku, literally, to eat bitterness. It means to endure difficulty, to persist through hard times without complaint, to do the unglamorous work that pays off later. And in the context of wealth building, it's enormously relevant. Here's the uncomfortable truth about building wealth. There is a period, and for most people it's a long period, where it doesn't feel like anything is happening. You're saving, you're investing, you're being disciplined, and your net worth is growing, but slowly, and it doesn't feel like progress because the numbers are still small relative to what you want them to be. This is the chiku phase, and most people quit during it. The psychological research on this is actually really interesting. There's something called present bias, the tendency for humans to overvalue immediate rewards compared to future ones. It's why we'll choose $50 today over $100 in 6 months, even though $100 in 6 months is the better deal mathematically. We are literally wired to undervalue the future. And wealth building is entirely a game of overriding that instinct. Chiku is essentially a cultural framework for making peace with present sacrifice. It reframes the boring, slow, unsexy middle phase of wealth building as something honorable, as evidence of character, not evidence of failure to enjoy life. When you chiku, you're not losing. You're earning something that can't be taken away. I think about this sometimes when I'm tempted to do something financially stupid, which honestly is more often than I'd like. The question I've started asking myself is, am I treating this moment as the goal or as the journey? Because wealth doesn't get built in moments of excitement. It gets built in thousands of quiet, boring, disciplined moments that nobody sees and nobody claps for. And the people who can sit with that, who can chiku, are the ones who eventually have something real. The real estate obsession. And what it actually signals. If you've ever spent any time around Chinese families, particularly first and second generation immigrant families in Southeast Asia, North America, Australia, or Europe, you've probably noticed the almost universal emphasis on property ownership. Chinese households, statistically, have remarkably high rates of homeownership and real estate investment. And it would be easy to just say, oh, it's a cultural thing, and leave it there. But I think the deeper reasoning is really worth unpacking. The obsession with real estate in Chinese culture isn't primarily about appreciation. The idea that property values will go up. It's about something much more fundamental: tangibility, physical, immovable, real. Something that can be passed down. Something that governments can't inflate away as easily as paper money. Something that produces utility whether or not its market value increases. This connects back to historical trauma, actually, and I think this part matters. Much of Chinese financial culture was shaped by generations of extreme instability, wars, famines, political upheaval, currency collapses. Families that had accumulated wealth in purely financial form, paper money, bank deposits, often lost everything overnight during these periods. But families that owned land and property had something that persisted, and that memory, passed down through generations, created a deep cultural instinct toward hard assets. Now, I'm not saying you should go buy property right now, regardless of your situation. That would be irresponsible advice without knowing your circumstances. But the principle underneath the property obsession is worth internalizing. Build your wealth in forms that are durable. Not all wealth is equally resilient. Cash in a savings account is vulnerable to inflation. A trendy investment is vulnerable to market sentiment. A skill, a business, a piece of productive land, a solid education, these are durable. Think in terms of durability, not just returns. The education investment, that isn't talked about enough. You've probably heard about the emphasis on education in Chinese culture. Tiger moms, exam pressure, the Gao Cow. It's almost a cliche at this point. But underneath the cultural stereotypes is a financial principle that is completely sound and radically underutilized by most people. Chinese families have historically treated education, specifically the development of high-value, marketable skills, as the single best return on investment available to them. Not stocks, not real estate, human capital. The idea that investing in a person's capability is the investment that compounds the most reliably over a lifetime. And the research actually backs this up. Studies consistently show that the wage premium for education and specialized skills, even adjusted for the cost of acquiring those skills, is one of the highest returning investments available to most people, especially those who don't start with significant capital. Here's the thing that I find really interesting about this, though. The Chinese cultural emphasis on education isn't just about getting a degree. It's about becoming genuinely, irreplaceably capable at something. There's a difference between going to school and actually developing deep competence. And the families that take this seriously aren't just ticking a box. They're deliberately trying to make themselves and their children difficult to replace in the labor market. In a world where a lot of jobs are getting automated, commoditized, or outsourced, this principle feels more relevant than ever. The question worth asking yourself is, what am I genuinely deeply competent at? What would make me difficult to replace? And am I investing in developing that, or am I coasting on what I already know? Because here's the hard truth. The most reliable wealth-building tool most of us have access to isn't a stock portfolio or a piece of property. It's our earning capacity. And that is built through deliberate, ongoing investment in our own capability. Generational thinking. Playing a game that lasts longer than you. This might be the most profound and also the most challenging concept in this whole conversation. And it's the one that I think creates the biggest gap between cultures that accumulate wealth over generations and those that don't. It's the idea of thinking in generational time horizons rather than personal ones. In much of Chinese financial philosophy, the relevant question isn't, how will this decision affect me? It's, how will this decision affect my children and their children? Wealth is understood not as a personal achievement, but as a relay baton. Something you receive, build upon, and pass forward. This creates a completely different set of incentives. If I'm playing a 30-year game, I'll make very different decisions than if I'm playing a 3-year game. I'll be more willing to sacrifice comfort now. I'll be more interested in durable assets than flashy ones. I'll be more careful about debt. I'll be more intentional about what I teach my children about money, not just because I love them, but because they are, in a sense, the continuation of a project I started. The contrast with a lot of Western financial culture is stark, honestly. There's a famous phrase, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, which describes how wealth built in one generation is usually spent by the third. And versions of this proverb exist in almost every culture, which tells you this is a pretty universal pattern. Wealth dissipates without deliberate effort to preserve it, but the families and cultures that beat this pattern share a common thread. They talk about money explicitly across generations. Grandparents teach grandchildren. Financial values are transmitted intentionally, not accidentally. The children grow up understanding not just that the family has money, but why they have it and how it was built, and therefore what would be required to maintain it. Most of us didn't grow up in households where money was discussed openly and wisely. A lot of us are figuring this out as we go, and that's okay. It just means we have to be more intentional. The generational shift starts with you, even if it started nowhere else in your family. So let's come back to that image from the beginning. The paycheck that arrives full of possibility and leaves quietly. The treadmill that looks like progress. The gap between knowing what you should do and actually doing it. What I hope you're leaving this conversation with is not a list of tactics, though there were tactics in here. It's more of a framework shift, because the Chinese principles we've talked about today aren't really about money in a technical sense. They're about how you relate to money. They're about identity, community, time, and values. Jian, frugality not as sacrifice but as preparation. Xian kun hao hua, saving as the goal, not the means. The merchant mindset that treats your household like a small business worth managing seriously. The bamboo network that reminds you wealth is easier to build in community than in isolation. Chiku, the willingness to endure the unglamorous middle stretch without quitting. The obsession with durable assets rather than flashy returns. The belief that investing in human capability is the highest return investment available to most people. And the generational vision. The idea that you're not just building something for yourself, but starting something that could outlast you. None of these are magic. None of them will turn your finances around in a month. But here's what I've found, and what I think the research and the history genuinely support. Small habits, consistently applied within the right mental framework over a long period of time, produce outcomes that look extraordinary from the outside. The magic isn't in the individual moves. It's in the compounding of consistent, values-aligned decisions made over years and decades. You don't have to be Chinese to use these principles. You don't have to have grown up in a household that practiced any of them. You just have to decide today that the way you've been thinking about money is worth examining. Not because you've failed, but because you can do better. And doing better starts with understanding differently. The treadmill doesn't have to be your life. You can step off it. You can start actually building something. And the first step is just taking these ideas seriously enough to let them sit with you for a while, to poke at your habits, to ask the uncomfortable questions. That's where it starts. It always has been.